Continue now at the top of Daf Chavdalin Amud Aleph and Meseches Moed Kattan. This is Moed Kattan Daf 24a. The Gemara says, "Boy minei Rabbi Yochanan mishmuel." Rabbi Yochanan asked Shmuel the following question: Yesh avelos b'Shabbos or ein avelos b'Shabbos? Is there avelos on Shabbos or is there not avelos on Shabbos? The simple understanding of the question is whether there's private avelos on Shabbos. It's obvious that there's no public displays of mourning on Shabbos. Amar lei, so he said back to him, "Ein avelos b'Shabbos." There's no avelos on Shabbos. Yosvi Rabbanan Kami de Rapapa. The Rabbanan were sitting in front of Rapapa. V'ka'amri mishmei de Shmuel, and they said in the name of Shmuel, "Avel shashimesh mitasu b'meyevlo." If an avel has relations during the time of avelos, chayev misa is chayev misa. So Amarlu Rapapa, so Rapapa said to them, Aser Itmar. It wasn't that it's Chayev Misa, it's just forbidden to do it. And also Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan Itmar. It wasn't a statement in the name of Shmuel. Really, this was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. V'yishmiel l'chu Mishmei de Shmuel. Now, if you did hear something in the name of Shmuel, Hachi Shmiel l'chu, here's what you actually heard. Here's what Shmuel actually said. Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avimei Amar Shmuel. Rav Tachlifa bar Avimei says in the name of Shmuel, Avel shelo para v'shelo pirem chayev misa. When you have an avel, let's say he doesn't, let's say he cuts his hair, he doesn't grow out his hair, or he does not tear his clothing, so he's chayev misa. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, Rashechem al tifru uvigdechem lo sifrom uvelo samusu v'gomer. This was the pasuk again by Nadav and Avihu. So they were not supposed to conduct themselves like normal mourners. They were supposed to cut their hair. They were not supposed to tear their clothing. And it said velo samusu, you won't die. So we can infer ha'acher. But if it was somebody else, meaning somebody who was not an exception, so shelo para v'shelo pirem. If it was somebody else and that person did not grow out the hair, meaning they cut their hair and they didn't tear their clothing, so chayev misa, that actually would be a reason to be chayev misa. Amar Rafram bar Papa says, Tana ba'avel Rabasi. It was taught in Avel Rabasi. Avel Rabasi is one of the Meseches Katanas. It's known as Meseches Smachos, has halachas of Avelus. So it says, Avel aser l'shamish mitasu b'meyevlo. Again, an Avel is forbidden in Tashmish Hamita, having relations during the time of the Avelus. There's a story with an individual who did this during the times of his Avelus. When the pigs, they took away his body. Rashi over here says, Giviyaso kol gufo. It means to say his whole body. In other words, the chazerim, they took his body after he had died. He did not get a proper burial. Some have a different understanding of what it means over here. Aver shalo. Giviyaso actually refers to his aver, and it means to say again that they attacked that particular aver, and it was a punishment, midah keneged midah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel says, Pachaz chova. Pachaz, this is a mnemonic that the Gemara is going to explain. And Nasar Rishus. Pachaz is an obligation. Nasar is something that is allowed. It is a Rishus. What does it mean to say? It means as follows. Priyas Harosh. So Priyas Harosh means the uncovering of the head. And chazaras kerel achor, of turning the tear, when you tear your garments, it's supposed to be visible from the front, turning it to the back. And zekifa samita, and also turning the bed upright, not overturning the bed. Chova, that's an obligation on Shabbos, meaning all of these things, you're not allowed on Shabbos to conduct yourself in mourning with regards to these issues. You have to keep your head uncovered, you can't cover it like you're in Avelos, you have to put the tear behind you, you can't show it, and you have to turn the bed upright, you can't overturn it. That's all an obligation. But Ne'ilas HaSandal Tashmish Hamita Rechitzas Yadayim V'Raglayim B'cham and Arvis Rishus. When it comes to wearing shoes, when it comes to Tashmish Hamita, when it comes to washing the hands and the feet in hot water in the evening, that's a Rishus. That's something that you are allowed to do, meaning you're allowed to continue to conduct yourself as a mourner with regards to these things, because it's not obvious that you're in mourning. So for example, by Ne'ilas HaSandal, you're allowed to go without wearing shoes, because there are other people who are not mourners who also don't wear shoes. It's not obvious that you're in mourning. Tashmish Hamita also, you can refrain. It's not obvious that you're in mourning. And again, with rechitzas yadayim v'raglayim b'cham and arvis rishus. So again, normally you're allowed to wash your hands and your feet in hot water if it was heated up before Shabbos on Friday night. That's okay. You're allowed to refrain in this situation. It's not a problem. It's not obvious that you're in mourning. For Rav Amar, and Rav says, Af priyas harosh rishus. No, even if you want for the uncovering of the head, that's also rishus. Meaning, even if you want to keep your head covered, it's not an obligation to uncover your head. If you want, you can keep your head covered. Again, some people do that. It's not obvious that you're in mourning. Ushmuel, and so the Gemara now says, now according to Shmuel, what's the difference by the wearing of the shoes? That's something you could do if you want, you don't have to. Because not everybody wears shoes, so it's not obvious if your shoes are off that you're in mourning. So Priyas Harosh Nami, the same should be true with the uncovering of the head. Lav Kuliyam Avidi de Miglu Rashayu. Not everybody covers their head. So if you want to cover your head, not everybody uncovers their head. So therefore, if you cover your head in mourning, it's not obvious that you're in mourning. Maybe you're like the other people who cover up their head. And so the Gemara explains, Shmuel l'taime. Shmuel over here is following his opinion. Diamar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Kol kera she'eno b'shas chimum, eno kera. First he says that when you tear your garments for avelus, it has to be at the time of grief, at the moment of grief. If you don't tear at the time of grief, that's not called really kriya in terms of the halachas of avelus. V'chol atifa she'eno ka'atifas yishma'elim, eno atifa. And also, when we talk about covering the head, wrapping the head as a mourner, it has to be the same way that the Arabs wrap their head. Otherwise, it's not considered for mourning. It's not for avelus. Now, if that's the case, so if a person's going to wrap katifas yishma'elim on Shabbos, that already is going to be obvious that the person is in mourning, and that's going to be a problem to do that on Shabbos. What exactly is atifas yishma'elim? Machvir of Nachman demonstrated what atifas yishma'elim is at guve de dikna. Guve de dikna literally means where there's a depression by the beard. Rashi over here explains guve dikna gumos shabelechi. It means the depressions by the cheek, lamata mipiv, right below his mouth. The idea is that the Yishmaelim used to wrap up that part. They would wrap it by the mouth area when they would wrap their heads. And so again, that's the kind of atifa that you need in terms of the atifa for an avil. The Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela she'ein lo min alayim baraglav. This idea that you're not allowed to wrap your head, that's only true if he's not wearing shoes. If he's not wearing shoes, and then he goes and he wraps his head, then he really looks like a mourner. Aval yesh lo min alayim baraglav. But if the person is wearing shoes on his feet, min olav mochich and olav, then already the shoes demonstrate that he's not doing any public displays of avelus, then it wouldn't be a problem to cover the head. And the Gemara continues, Kol kera she'eno b'shas chimum eno kera. We said above that any time you tear, but if it's not during the time of grief, that's not really called kriya in terms of avelus. Is that really true? V'amru leila Shmuel, but they said to Shmuel, noch nafshe de Rav, that Rav had died, and karo alea treis armoni, he teared 12 garments over the death of Rav. Amar, because he said, Azal gavra dehava mistapina minei. A person has died who I was afraid of, meaning I was afraid of his difficult question, so I have to tear this kind of kriya. And the Gemara continues with a similar story. Amru leila Rabbi Yochanan. They said to Rabbi Yochanan, Nach nafshe de Rabbi Chanina, that Rabbi Chanina has died. So karala tleiser itzle milsa. He tore 13 garments that were made of fine wool. Amar, and he said similarly, Azal gavra dehava mistapina minei. A person who I was afraid of has died. So in any case, the point of the Gemara is, if you're tearing 12 or 13 garments, it's clear you're not only tearing at the time of the grief. And so the Gemara answers, Shani Rabbanan, it's different by the Rabbanan. To Kevan the Choshaita Midkrish Matayos, since all of the time their shmuos, their teachings are being mentioned, Keshas Chimam Dami. So it's always considered to be the time of the grief, and therefore, at any time that you tear, that would be considered a valid kriya in terms of Avelus. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravin Barada le Rava. Ravin Barada said to Rava, Amar Talmidcha Rav Amram. Your student Rav Amram said as follows, Tanya, that we learned in a Brisa, Avil kol shiva koru lefanav. In Avil, all 7 days he has to keep the tear in front. It has to be visible. V'im bala hachlif machlif. Now, if he wants to switch clothing, he can switch clothing. V'koreyan, he can tear that new clothing. The Brisa continues, b'Shabbos, but on Shabbos, koru le'achorav, he keeps the tear behind him. It's not visible. V'im bala hachlif machlif. And if he wants to switch clothing, he can switch clothing. Ve'eno koreya, and he doesn't tear. So in any case, the Gemara here also is asking a question, because if you're switching garments and tearing the new garment, it's not the time of the grief. Why are you able to do kriya at that time? And so the Gemara answers, Kitanya ahi, that Bryce is talking specifically, b'chavod I aviv v'imo. We're talking about for the honor of his father and mother. In an avelus that's not for the father and mother, so then it has to be that it's only at the time of the grief. But when it comes to a person's father and mother, so then they can even tear when they switch garments, even if it's not the moment of grief, that still would be considered a kriya. The Gemara says, Osan karoin misachin oin misachin. Now these tears that you're doing on the other garments, so in general, usually by the father and the mother, you're never supposed to sew up the tear. It's supposed to be forever. But what about by these other garments where you were machlif and you tore those? Are those misachin? Are you allowed to sew them up, stitch them up, or is that not allowed? So the Gemara says, Pligi bo avud Rav Oshia Bar Kapara. That's a machlokus between the father of Rav Oshia and Bar Kapara. Chadam rein mesachin, v'chadam mesachin. One says they cannot be stitched up. One says it could be stitched up. And the Gemara says, Tistayim di avud Rav Oshia dam rein mesachin. We should conclude that it's the father of Rav Oshia who says it cannot be stitched up. Dam Rav Oshia in mesachin, because Rav Oshia himself said it cannot be stitched up. Miman Shmuel. Now who did he hear that from? Lav me'avua. Didn't he hear it from his father? So you can assume that he holds the same as his father. So the Gemara says it's not necessarily a proof. Lo no mi Bar Kapara Rabbi Shmuel. It's possible that he heard it from Bar Kapara, because Bar Kapara was his Rebbe. So it's actually a machlokus between his father and his Rebbe, so it's unclear who he was following. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava, Rava says, Avil Metayel B'unkali B'soch Beso, an Avil on Shabbos is allowed to go with his torn robe. Since he's within his house, it's not considered a public display of Avelus. Abaya Ashkechel Rav Yosef Teparis Le Sudra Reshe. Abaya found Rav Yosef that he was wearing a sudra, he was wearing a scarf on his head. V'yazol v'asi v'vei, and he was going in his house. Again, he was doing that out of mourning, and it was on Shabbos. So Amar Le said to him, Lav Savar Lamar Ein Avelus B'Shabbos. Doesn't the master hold that there's no Avelus on Shabbos? How can you walk around in this manner on Shabbos? Amar Le said to him, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. This is what Rabbi Yochanan says: Devarim shebetzina noeg, things that are done in private in terms of avelus. If it's a private avelus, it is done on Shabbos. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Elazar Omer Mishacharev Beis Hamikdash Atzeres Kashabbos v'chulu. Rabbi Elazar said that from the time that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, so Atzeres, so Shavuos, is considered to be on Shabbos. Now Rabbi Gamliel in the Mishnah said that Atzeres and also Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, those are considered to be like the regalim, and they actually do interrupt the avelus. And the Chachamim in the Mishnah said, Lo kedivrei zeh v'lo kedivrei zeh. They said Atzeres is considered like the regalim, but Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is considered like Shabbos. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Gidel bar Menashe Amar Shmuel. Rav Gidel bar Menashe says in the name of Shmuel, Halacha ka Rabbi Gamliel. The halacha is like Rabbi Gamliel. Again, Rabbi Gamliel saying that these days, like Atzeres and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, they're considered like the regalim. That's the halacha. Now, some have a different version, that when Rav Gidel bar Menashe said halacha, this halachic statement, it was going on the following. It says, Kol lamed yom, let's say it's the first 30 days that a baby is born, and the baby dies within 30 days of its birth. So tinok yotze bechek. So when you take the tinok, this baby, to be buried, you take him out in the bosom. You don't take him out, in other words, in any kind of a box. You just take him out holding the baby. V'nikvar, and the baby is buried, bi'isha achas u'shnei anoshim, with one woman and two men. But not with one man and two women. And Rashi over here explains, Kol lamed yom, for the first 30 days, yotze bechek, he's taken out in the bosom. Ben lamed yom motzio bechek leves hakvaros v'lo ba'aron. The point is, you don't put him inside of an aron in that situation. Avlo b'ish echad, but you're not allowed to have one man with two women. The point is, she'ein mesiachden im isha, one man is not allowed to be in isolation together with two women. That's a problem of yichud. And in the beis hakvaros, where there's no one really around in the cemetery, so that's considered a yichud issue. So that's why the idea over here is that the baby is buried with very few people, but it should be one woman with two men rather than having one man and two women, because then again it's going to be a yichud problem. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Daled Amud Beis.